G'day, this is a comparison between the Canon RF 35mm f1.8 macro IS STM and the Canon RF 50mm f1.8 STM. Back in a tick. Okay, so here we have both the lenses, the Canon RF 35mm f1.8 macro IS STM and the Canon RF 50mm f1.8 STM. Today we're going to run them side by side to see what you get out of each of these lenses and how they compare to each other. Now to start off, both of these lenses are made specifically for the Canon R series of mirrorless cameras. So that's the Canon EOS R, the RP, the R5, the R6, the RA, the soon to be coming R3, and not far away the R1. Woohoo! Okay, so let's start off with the focal length. I've already said them. One of the lenses is 35mm, so it's slightly wider than the other lens, which is a bit tighter. That's the 50mm. They are both considered to be fairly natural views, similar to what the human eye can see when used on a full-frame 35mm sensor. And that's basically all of the Canon R series mirrorless cameras at the moment. If in the future they do release a crop sensor camera for the R series, then hopefully these will still fit on with the RF mounts, but of course then the focal lengths will be slightly tighter. At this stage you cannot adapt these lenses to any other series of Canon cameras. They will only work on the Canon R series of mirrorless cameras. Okay, so max aperture. Both of these lenses are rated maximum aperture f1.8. They both have the same maximum aperture, so that's great. They're basically an identical lens as far as the aperture is concerned. The thing about the aperture being at f1.8 is that's fairly fast glass, and these lenses are the cheapest and the second cheapest in the Canon RF series of lenses. Now I just want to jump in on the 35mm here at this point and say that this lens also has image stabilization built into the body. The RF 50mm does not. Furthermore, the 35mm has a macro function that allows it to have the closest focusing distance of 17 centimeters from the sensor to the subject, whereas the 50mm is 30 centimeters from the sensor to the subject. Remember, that's from the sensor to the subject, not from the end of the lens, but from the sensor to the subject. Now that is really cool because it enables you to take close-up detailed shots with the one lens, so you can actually get quite a bit closer on the tight shots with the RF 35mm. And what that actually does is it overlaps at the tight end the closest focusing distance of the 50mm. So what that means is you can actually get a tighter frame at the closest focusing distance on the 35mm than you can with the 50mm, even though the 50mm is a tighter lens in terms of its focal length. Okay, now moving to the size, they are both relatively compact lenses. As you can see here, the 35mm is slightly more stout and it's slightly taller than the 50mm. But generally speaking, they're both very compact lenses, so they both actually set up as really compact packages on your Canon R series cameras. In terms of the weight, yeah, well, the 35mm is heavier. The 50mm is so light. In fact, they're both really light. The 35mm is a little bit heavier, but hey, you're certainly not going to struggle with carrying or transporting either of these two lenses. If we have a look at the bodies, they're both made of engineering plastic and they are both sitting upon a metal mount here. The thing is that neither of these lenses are weather sealed, so you do have to take a little bit of care about that. Remembering that most of the R series cameras are weather sealed, but if you are using them with a non-weather sealed lens, you essentially compromise that protection built into the camera. Now the 35mm has two manual switches on here, one for autofocus and manual focus, and also one for image stabilizer on, image stabilizer off. The 50mm has just the one control switch, and that is for changing from focus to the control ring. Speaking of the control ring, both of these lenses have the control ring, which enables you to access other settings in your EOS R series of cameras, such as ISO or exposure compensation, or whatever setting you may wish to choose out of the options available to you. Control rings are pretty good. To be honest, I don't use them, but if I was going to use it, I'd be using it for exposure compensation. I have tried using it for ISO, but I tended to knock the control ring more often than not and change the ISO settings, and that can actually cause some problems if you don't know you've done it. One difference about the control rings, however, is that the 35mm has a click. Can you hear that clicking there? Whereas the 50mm is completely silent. And there's actually pros and cons to having clicks or no clicks on the control ring. For me, I prefer the control ring on the 50mm being clickless because that's better for video if you're using the inbuilt microphone, or if you have a camera mounted microphone, you won't be picking up clicks while you're shooting video. The pros of having a click on the control ring, however, is that you know how far you're changing the settings without having to take your eye off the subject. It's 3 clicks per stop, so you can actually tell how far you're making the adjustment, whereas with the clickless control ring, you don't get that tactile response to know how many stops you're adjusting your settings. Okay, let's jump to the price. The Canon RF 50mm is the cheapest lens in the RF lineup. It's $200 US. Here in New Zealand, it's about $420, whereas the Canon RF 35mm is more around the $400 US mark. Here in New Zealand, it's about $800 to $1,000 brand new. So the RF 35mm is certainly twice as expensive as the 50mm, but we're going to get to it. It's actually twice as good. I mean, 35mm is considered a wide angle lens, I guess, but I don't figure it to be that wide. It's actually not hugely wide, it's just quite a natural frame. Whereas the 50mm, I find I struggle with the focal length a little bit, because when I want it to be wide, it's not quite wide enough, and when I want it to be tight, it's just not quite tight enough. But the facts are clear, with the macro function in the 35mm, you can get a tighter frame than you can with the 50mm. Okay, so let's have a look at some photos with these lenses. And first of all, we're going to look at some photographs at the tight end of the range, and as you can see, the 35mm does get a much tighter frame than the 50mm. Now, in terms of the image quality, they're both reasonably similar. I do find, especially at the tight end, the 50mm performs really, really well, but that's not always the case, and as we move a little bit wider, you are going to see what I mean. So the 35mm is actually wider, as you would expect, being that it's got the wider focal length, but having said that, the 50mm still takes pretty good photos. The thing I found with the 50mm shooting beyond the minimum focusing distance, or particularly when shooting landscapes or wide shots, is it does have a pretty heavy vignette, and it also does suffer from quite a bit of distortion. Now, you can correct this in post, but remember, they are extra steps in your workflow, and so far in programs, let's take Lightroom, there doesn't seem to be a profile to apply in terms of lens correction at this time. The 35mm doesn't suffer anywhere near as much vignette or distortion, and I find the files are cleaner, easier to work with, and actually more pleasing all around with the 35mm. But I guess you could expect that, being that it is twice the price of the 50mm. Now, both of these lenses do flare. The 50mm flares a little bit worse than the 35mm, and particularly when shooting directly into bright light or at a slightly oblique angle. Okay, my recommendation, look, I own both of these lenses, but if I had the choice now, I probably wouldn't buy the 50mm. I think it is okay if you want to get an inexpensive 50mm lens for your R series of cameras, but if you are able to, or if you have the patience or the inclination to do so, what I would say to you is hold on to your cash and pick up the 35mm. You can still get the tight frames, even tighter than you can with the 50mm. You still get great wide shots. The quality is much better out of the 35mm, according to me. And not only that, it's a much more versatile lens with the macro function and the image stabilization built into the lens. So that's it. It's a comparison between the RF 35mm f1.8 macro IS STM and the RF 50mm f1.8 STM. I hope it was of some use to you. If you do have any other questions, or I haven't covered something that's of interest to you, please let me know below. Otherwise, in the meantime, have a great day, have a great week, have a great month, whatever works for you, and we'll see you next time. Bye.